Welcome to another edition of the Commodore 64 Compilation Comparison. Today's compilation review is a budget compilation. This is Foremost Action, which was published by Alternative Software and originally released in 1991, I think, for a price of £2.99. So 4 games on this one, none of which I've ever played before. So let's take a look at the compilation packaging and then take a look at those 4 games. Let's begin by taking a look at the packaging for this one then, and as you can see, it's quite busy. There's a lot going on there. You've got the covers of the 4 games as they were originally published by Alternative Software in the background, and it says Foremost Action over the top there, and also 4 in 1 kind of bursting out of a bullet hole, I suppose that's supposed to be. The 4 games are Strike Force Cobra, Combat Zone, Gunboat and Dead or Alive, 2 of which were originally published by Alternative Software and 2 of which are releases of games from another publisher, which I'll get into in due course, but they were re-released by Alternative at budget price. So the spine there, it says Foremost Action on as well. Again, that's quite nicely done. And on the back we've got, again, some bullet holes coming out of the packaging because it's obviously action based. The logo for the Foremost Action again, and then 4 screenshots. So there you can see Strike Force Cobra, Combat Zone, Gunboat and Dead or Alive. No description of what the games are about, but that goes on in the inside of the instructions, so we'll take a look at that in a sec. So yeah, overall pretty nicely presented on the outside. I do think, as I said, it's a bit busy, quite hard to tell what's going on the front in particular, but fairly attractive nonetheless. So here's the tape, and again it's got some specific printing on it for this compilation, so it says Foremost Action on it. You can see the list of games there on the left hand side, and also it's got the loading instructions. Quite oddly, it's got the loading instructions for the Spectrum, Commodore 64 and Amstrad, even though this is quite obviously the Commodore 64, so I guess they printed it sort of generic for the 3 different systems, and then printed which system it was for on it as well, so a little bit strange there, but overall again I think that's quite nicely presented. Moving on now to the instructions, and they're pretty good. You know, there's lots of information in here. I'll just expand this out actually to just show how much you get there. So you've got the overview of the different games with the instructions. There's quite a lot of instructions for Strike Force Cobra. That's quite a deep game. Again, we've got the bullet holes going on across the packaging as well. It also gets an introduction here saying it's excitement all the way in Foremost Action, thrilling 4 games on 1 cassette, presenting you with some of the world's dangerous enemies. It says in Strike Force Cobra you have to blah blah blah, and it gives an overview of Dead or Alive, Combat Zone and Gunboat as well, which I can't be bothered to read, but it says, have you got the nerve? Find out in Foremost Action. Then, as I say, it's got the overview of Strike Force Cobra, which is definitely the biggest game in terms of depth in the compilation, and then we've got the other games on the back here as well. And I did mention in the intro that I think this was released in 1991, but on the packaging here it says 1989, but all the other information I've got in terms of reviews of the game in a magazine, adverts and things like that suggest it was released in 1991, so I think that's probably a bit of printing error come from another packaging layout that they probably had that they sort of reused for this one. It's also got adverts for a couple of the other Foremost compilations there, Foremost Sport and Foremost Horror. So overall, yeah, pretty impressed with the packaging on this one. I think that's pretty nice. I'm not really expecting the games to be much good, but we should probably take a look at them and find out. Before I jump into the reviews of the 4 games, I'm going to just take a quick look at this advert from Alternative Software. This was in various magazines in the early 90s and showcases a range of their games, which are mainly licenses from kids' TV shows. The Foremost range is covered in the bottom right hand corner, however, and one of the 2 featured compilations there is Foremost Action, which I'm looking at in this video. All this really does is confirm that the retail price was £2.99 and says that each one contains 4 great games on 1 cassette. Also at the very bottom right of this advert, it says that Alternative Software Limited are obviously the best, and well, based on previous experience of titles from this publisher, I think that's a very dubious claim. But I'll try not to be biased by previous experience and take each game as it comes. So let's look at the first one now, and this is Strike Force Cobra, which was originally released by Piranha Software in 1986 and had already been re-released by Alternative Software as the standalone title. The backstory for this one says the world is threatened with nuclear blackmail by an evil genius known as the Enemy. That's an original name. He's developed a computer system capable of hacking into defense computers around the globe. Unless world leaders yield to his demand for total dominance, he'll run the program that will destroy the world totally. To develop the hacking system, he kidnapped top computer scientists from throughout the world and forced them to work for him. Now these experts imprisoned in his fortress would help anyone to destroy the main computer by giving one of the secret codes required to open the computer room door. Facing a choice between enslavement and destruction, the world leaders have created an elite strike force named Cobra. Their mission is to enter the enemy's fortress, bypass its defences and locate, attack and destroy the main computer. There's little information on the fortress except that it's on 4 levels and is heavily guarded. To overcome the defences, you must work closely as a team, which you must choose at the beginning of the game from 4 out of the available 8 members, each of which has their own skill set. You're provided with a digital lock breaker which you'll need to unlock the main computer room door. You must locate as many scientists as possible to obtain digits for the door code. You'll need a minimum of 6 of the 9 code digits to stand any chance of opening the door before the time runs out, and the fewer digits you have, the longer it will take to open the door. Movement of your squad members is done using a combination of the joystick and keyboard controls that allow for jumping, crouching and diving, and you switch between the 4 characters using keys 1 to 4. Having seen the monochrome graphics and isometric perspective of this game, you can probably already guess how this review is going to go. This is another lazy port of the Spectrum version of the game, and while the detail and design of the characters and enemies would have looked good on the Sinclair system, they look crap on the C64. The sound effects are minimal, but that actually makes them quite effective in this stealthy game with just the occasional siren going off or enemies reacting to your presence. As befits a specky port, there's no music in-game and it doesn't have a title screen to speak of, so there's no tune there either. Navigating the fortress is confusing to begin with. It is a flick screen game, but not in a consistent way, so sections of the previous room appear on the next one, but it's not clear that's what's going on when you first start playing. Movement is very slow when there's anything else on the screen that moves other than the player, which is another symptom of the lack of care taken in porting the game over. It has the usual issues that affect most isometric games, such as getting stuck behind walls or objects and the difficulty in lining up movement to avoid hazards. When you combine that with the need to use keyboard controls for jumping, diving and so on, you have a recipe for frustration. I had several attempts at the game and made very little progress, with most characters dying by moving onto a screen where an object drained their health before you could react due to how slow it is. I didn't initially realise that you could dive through windows, so that did open the game up a lot, but with no map it's hard to know where to go or even where your other squad members are. As a result, progress is generally made through trial and error rather than any real skill. On that note, the skills that are listed for each character on the opening squad selection screen don't appear to have much impact in-game, although perhaps I just didn't get far enough to utilise them. The game is an ambitious idea for the era and maybe it worked better on the Spectrum, but this version is slow and unrewarding. It seems like it was a massive game for the mid-80s and probably needs a lot of time invested in it, but its shortcomings stopped me from being interested in progressing after a few tries. So it's not for me, but I accept that it might be quite engrossing if you put enough time into it, and I accept the flaws of this version. The second game on the compilation is Combat Zone, which was originally published by Alternative Software in 1987. Ace of Aces Colonel John D. Mentor of the United World Forces, an instructor from the Intergalactic Space Force School, has been recalled to active duty as possibly the only person alive capable of surviving the combat zone. On each stage you must destroy the enemy power station, and to do so you must weaken its defences by destroying at least 20 enemy installations in one pass. The installations are easily recognisable as pulsating objects on the ground. If you fail, you must attempt extra passes through the same zone before you can progress. In addition to the ground attacks, you must also eliminate waves of flying enemies. Capturing a diamond-shaped enemy supply ship will win you a hyperbomb, and detonating this bomb will destroy all enemy fighters in view. When I was trying to find information about this one, there are 2 games called Combat Zone on Lemon 64, but this isn't either of those. Based on the reviews of those 2 games though, this is equally as bad. It's one of the poorest looking games I've seen on the C64 for some time. It's got a tiny play area, incredibly slow scrolling and basic sound effects. The player sprites also move slowly, while enemies move much faster and are therefore hard to avoid. There's a good variety of enemies, but most are just blue and half the time you can't see them or the bullets on the background, whose graphics are ugly as hell by the way. As if the look and sound wasn't bad enough, it's hard to even start the game as you need to press fire multiple times to get any reaction. The gameplay is a similar style to the arcade game Xevious, as you scroll up the screen shooting waves of enemies and bombing ground-based targets. The instructions say you need to hit 20 of those targets, but there don't seem to be that many in the level, so you never complete it. I tried multiple times and I'm sure I destroyed all the obvious surface targets, but it's never good enough, so it just resets the level. There's a status panel full of information, but some of it's pointless, such as fuel that never runs out, and yet it's missing the most important thing, which is how many surface targets you've destroyed. Collisions with enemy ships will lose you a life, whereas the shots will just drain your shields. The instructions state that you have 3 lives, but you actually have 5, although you can get stuck being hit by one enemy after another and lose 2 or 3 lives in a row quite easily. There are a few power-ups, but only one weapon, which is a smart bomb that flashes the classic C64 loading bars in the border when you trigger it. Aside from that, there's one that restores shields and another that gives you extra lives, not that they do you much good. On a system that's blessed with some brilliant shooters, this is a complete disgrace. With the inability to finish the first stage, it seems either incomplete or broken, and even if it wasn't, it's slow and boring. I suppose it's just about playable as a high score challenge if you wanted to repeat the same level over and over again to see how long you could last, but it's absolutely no fun at all. Next up is Gunboat, which is another game that was originally released by Piranha Software, this time in 1987. Your mission is to penetrate the complex network of inland waterways held by the enemy. Cause as much devastation as you can by attacking their warships, helicopter gunships, shore installations and anything else that comes your way. The main objective is to search out and destroy 4 major naval bases. If you can do this, you'll cripple the enemy's war effort and bring the desperate conflict to an end. You'll meet heavy resistance all the way and must watch your ship's serviceability as well as its fuel and ammo levels. You'll sometimes come across enemy shore depots, and if they're only lightly defended, then you can try docking to top up on fuel and ammo and even get some repairs made to your battered vessel. If you manage to locate the naval bases, your missiles are the best and quickest means of taking them out, so you should save them for the really important strikes. Unlike the first 2 games, this one has quite well drawn graphics with a variety of water and land based enemies, but almost everything's rendered in grey, so it's a bit bleak. The sound effects are fairly authentic, with gunshots, explosions and sirens, so while they're not outstanding, they do fit the game. Control of your gunboat is hard as you have to build up speed and then use rotational controls to manoeuvre through the narrow waterways. You move faster than you can turn, so this inevitably means you often end up crashing into the shore. The boat has 4 different weapons, 3 of which are fired with keys that are definable, but reaching for those keys in the heat of the action can be tricky. Of the 4, only the homing missile really seems to be effective for the most part. At the start of the game you have to wait for the boat to stock up on fuel and weapons, and all the time helicopters are firing at you, but you can use the missile to get rid of them and it will replenish while you're docked. Once you get moving though, you have to deal with all kinds of enemies that you'll have almost no chance of destroying before they start to damage you, so you can be sunk in a matter of seconds, especially as movement's so awkward. You only have 1 life, so games are usually over before you even get into them. It's a nice idea that you can choose your route through the waterways, but you barely get to see anything before being killed, and I never got close to seeing any of the bases, let alone destroying them. This is a much better looking game than Combat Zone, but amazingly it's even less playable, with slow movement, sluggish controls and too many enemies right from the start making progress almost impossible. For those reasons, it didn't take long for me to switch this one off. The final chance at redemption for this compilation is Dead or Alive, which was originally released by Alternative Software in 1987. As the Sheriff of Dodge City, you must stop the bandits getting away with the bags of money from the city bank and freeing their comrades from jail. Stopping the baddies will take it out of you a bit, so you have to keep an eye on your thirst level, and if it gets too low you can always pop into the hotel for a quick drink to top it up. You must also keep an eye on your ammo level. If it gets too low you can walk over the body of a dead bandit before it disappears and take his bullets. You must also keep an eye out for Neddy, the bandit's faithful horse. If you get in his way you'll be trampled. The presentation on this final game is pretty decent, with a nicely designed title screen that has a good SID tune, though it doesn't record high scores in any way. The in-game graphics are varied. The backgrounds are nicely designed with plenty of detail, especially the mountains, but on the other hand the character sprites are blocky and repetitive, though both them and the horse that runs across the screen occasionally are quite well animated. You get both music and sound effects in game, which is fairly rare for a budget title, though the choice of Are You Going to Scarborough Fair for the tune is an odd one. Gameplay wise this is a very basic single screen shooter, but it does have a couple of neat touches such as stopping the bank robbers and escaping prisoners, and replenishing health and bullets. It is problematic if you run out of bullets though, as you basically have to kill yourself off to make further progress. Eventually, if you survive long enough, you move on to a second stage in the wilderness, where it's just about outlasting the enemies, keeping an eye out for the red clothed outlaw who moves very quickly towards you. I never got past that level, and to be honest I didn't have much desire to play the game over and over again to see what came next. Dead or Alive is a very simple and repetitive game, but the Wild West aesthetic is fun, the presentation's okay and it's reasonably well designed and playable for a short time. That's the detailed look at these 4 games done with then, and you don't need me to tell you that this is a poor selection of games, and it just makes me glad I never decided to do a series about collecting alternative software titles if this is an example of the typical standard of them. Let's not prolong the agony any further and move on to the compilation rating, starting off as always with a score for each individual game. First up was Strike Force Cobra, and conceptually this squad-based action game seemed pretty good, and if you put enough time into it then maybe it'd be engrossing enough to overlook some of its flaws. For me though, this lacklustre Spectrum port didn't have enough to keep me interested, but I'm giving it a score of 5 out of 10 on the basis that it might appeal to gamers with more patience than I have. Combat Zone is a woefully slow and ugly scrolling shooter that seems to be broken, and even if it wasn't, it still wouldn't be much fun, so I'm giving it a score of 3. Gunboat's not a bad looking game, and with better controls, more lives and a shallower difficulty curve it might have been quite good. Unfortunately it has none of those things and is borderline unplayable, so I'm scoring it 2 out of 10. And finally, Dead or Alive is a very simple game that looks and sounds okay, but is unlikely to keep you interested for more than a few plays. The fact that for me this is the best game of the 4 speaks volumes about the quality of this compilation, and although I enjoyed it more than Strike Force Cobra, it still isn't worth more than 5 out of 10. Moving on to the overall compilation rating, and firstly the packaging, well the front cover might be a bit messy, but overall the inlay is fairly appealing and the instructions for all 4 games were comprehensive. The packaging is arguably the best part of this collection, and I'm scoring it 7 out of 10. The average score for the 4 games comes out at a pathetic 3.75, and in terms of value for money, well, it's a tough one. 4 games for under £3 should really ensure good value, but 2 of them are absolutely awful, and there's really only one that you might consider loading up more than once. When you compare it to some of the other budget 4 game packs I've reviewed, it seems poor value even at the low price, so I'm going to give it a value for money rating of 4. And that means that the compilation rating for Foremost Action comes out at a meagre 45%. Obviously I'm not impressed with this compilation at all, and to be honest I don't really want to talk about it anymore, but I suppose we should see what the gaming press thought about it back in 1991, and here's a review from the budget section of the June 1991 edition of Zap64. As if I wasn't annoyed enough by this compilation already, this review's messily spread over 2 pages and 3 columns, so I'm just going to pick out the most relevant points. There are screenshots of all 4 games, and more than half of the review text is dedicated to Strike Force Cobra, giving a quite detailed overview of that game. That's summed up by saying in issue 20 Strike Force Cobra won 68% despite the ominous conclusion that it's a nice idea which hasn't quite worked. 5 years on, the Spectrum graphics, minimalistic sound and tricky controls are even more disappointing, making for a poor first impression. However, if you do persist, the ability to kick indoors, crawl through tunnels and some interesting graphics mean it's not bad, and I think I probably concur with that to some extent because I think the more time you put into it, the more you could probably enjoy it. It then goes on to say the same certainly can't be said for Combat Zone, a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up that countless homegrown shoot 'em up construction kit games would put to shame. With a limited screen area and green enemy bullets getting lost on mainly green backgrounds, it's simply awful, and I couldn't agree more with that assessment. It then goes on to say Gunboat is no better. Your boat may have 4 different weapons to use, but you only get 1 life, and that's taken away with just 2 or 3 hits, and the rotational control method makes things even more confusing and frustrating, and again they're spot on with that one. And finally, they're not impressed with Dead or Alive either, saying apart from terminal boredom, the main threat is running out of ammo. The only way you can get more is by shooting someone, but if you've got no ammo, you can't shoot anyone. Unbelievably simple, this is a contender for the most pathetic game of all time, they say. I would disagree with that slightly, as I think that one was the most playable of the 4 games, even though it doesn't have much longevity. Anyway, they round up the review by saying apart from Strike Force Cobra, this compilation is useless unless you want to enjoy a good giggle at diabolical games, and they give it an overall score of 40%, so not too dissimilar from my 45. The final thing to do to round up this review is to see where Foremost Action has landed in my compilation league table, and for the budget compilation rankings we finally have a top 10, and Foremost Action has gone in right near the bottom at 9th place, with only the even more dismal Magnum Pack Volume 1 ranking lower. It should come as no surprise that it doesn't get anywhere near the top 12 when we look at the compilation rankings including full price ones, but we may as well look at that league table anyway. That brings this edition of the Commodore 64 Compilation Comparison to a close, and this is probably one of the shorter videos in this series, though the compilation I've just looked at didn't deserve any time at all in retrospect. If you've got any opinions on the 4 games featured in this compilation, or the compilation as a whole, then please sound off in the comments, and I'm not expecting too many positive ones this time around. That's been 2 pretty dismal compilation reviews in a row in this series, and I'm hoping the next one will be an improvement. In fact, if the name of it's anything to go by, it should be Ace. To find out what that compilation is, join me in a few weeks' time, and in the meantime there'll be plenty of other retro gaming content on this channel, so stay tuned. Thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next time, see ya!